that Bateson was at Oxford was one of the worst vivisectors in the world, that the importance of Christ could not have lain in what he said, that Pekingese were not dogs at all, but dwarf lions bred from smaller and ever smaller specimens by the Chinese through the ages. Aunt Lily was quite an eccentric. That matter was just the stop of motion, and that the cardinal error of all religions made by men was the assumption that God existed for or cared about us. I left Dimer, that was the poem he was working on. I left Dimer with her and got away with some difficulty at 1 o'clock. Anyway, that's his encounter with Aunt Lily. That's one of several encounters he had with Aunt Lily. Okay, tonight I want to talk about Lewis. Lewis wrote a lot about evil. And I want to look at his conception of what evil is and how it is made manifest in our world. Lewis had a lot to say about it. And what I want to talk tonight about is the problem of evil and the possibility of good. The complex and catastrophic nature of evil, the doctrine of human freedom, and then defining the good. So those are the three things I want to touch on tonight from Lewis's perspective. The complex and catastrophic nature of evil. It's very tempting in our world to talk about, to really spend a lot of time maneuvering around the concept of evil and the demonic. It's no fun to talk about. It's so much more polite and wonderful to say, well, we're all really good people. There is a divine spark in all of us. We can turn a blind eye to evil and just talk about, well, I'm just going to focus on the good and all things that are happy. Lewis did not do that. Lewis saw that there was a very complex and catastrophic nature of evil and how it is working in our world. One of our Reformed theologians that was actually a contemporary, they crossed a little bit, was a man named Reinhold Niebuhr. Some of you may have heard of Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr taught at Union Seminary. Now, you all know Jackie Huber is our organist. Jackie's dad, Larry Hostetler, studied at Union Seminary and actually took a class from Reinhold Niebuhr. I always think this is fascinating. Reinhold Niebuhr was one of the best thinkers, and still to this day, one of the best thinkers about the complex and catastrophic nature of evil. Sometimes we think of evil as, the little devil and the pitchfork, one on one shoulder, one on the other, the angel and the devil. We trivialize it. Niebuhr said and talked about how the depth of evil, how it invades everything in our world. It invades our lives and our souls, but it's so much more than that. He was not a lot of fun to invite to parties. They say that Niebuhr would preach for 45 minutes. It would be 43 minutes on sin and 2 minutes at the end on grace at the end. One of the things that Niebuhr talked a lot about, though, was not only are you and I capable of evil, not only is sin and evil nature something that can occupy us, we know this. I mean, if we look in our hearts, it's much easier to see it in other people. But we kind of know this. But Niebuhr took it another level. What happens when you get a whole group of people who have an evil nature? He said that even organizations are tainted. We don't think about this too much. Any organization or church that is preoccupied with its own self-survival is by nature evil. It's preoccupied with self, not preoccupied with God. So Niebuhr looked out and said, we as Christians ought to be really aware how pervasive it is. Now, Lewis lived through World War I, right? There was an early optimism in the early 1900s. There was a liberal optimism that said the society is getting better and better and better. It crept into the church. The church would talk and the sermons would talk about how everything is progressing to get better. Well, World War I really did a number on that. And if we weren't convinced, World War II did a number on it as well. One of the things that Lewis is really good at, like Niebuhr, is seeing the complexity of evil in our world and how catastrophic it is. And we ought to be able to talk about it. And he talks about it also in our human freedom, but we just can't leave it there. Lewis is also going to define the good, which is what we do here in the church so well, and which is so important. So Lewis would, and I think Lewis is a good example, any good story that you enjoy is really good at not just trivializing evil, but layering it, looking at it for what it really is. And when we're talking about it, there are levels or kinds of evil. Some of them are maybe lesser, but some are much more so. So we see this in Lewis's writings. We might say that the entry level into evil is just simply weakness. And this would be characterized by Mr. Tumnus. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Mr. Tumnus is not a horrific character. He's not an evil faun. He's not trying to destroy anyone. He's just weak. When presented by the queen, the evil witch, with an opportunity to turn in the children, he doesn't know what to do, but he just, out of his weakness, he gives in, unfortunately. He sees the error of his ways. In the Bible, sin is described with this Greek word armartia, and literally it just means to miss the mark. There's a lot of words for sin in the New Testament and evil. We find various words, but one of them is amartia. It means to miss the mark, miss the intent of your life. And one way we do that is by being weak, by not having courage. And we see that in Mr. Tumnus. And it's a doorway. If we're lazy, if we're weak, it's a doorway into all kinds of other evils. Then we might talk about selfishness as another level. Maybe it's more willful, a preoccupation with myself and my desires. We see this personified in Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. You know, the first line of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader talks about Eustace Clarence Scrub was his name, and he almost deserved it. It's one of the great opening lines of a book. His name was Eustace Clarence Scrub, and he almost deserved it. And he's preoccupied with self. He is quarrelsome. He is tiresome. Eustace is just a real pain to be around. The other children can't stand being around him because he's just irritating all the time. And if you've read this book, you know this story. At some point, because of this nature that he has, this selfish nature, he's actually banished. He's turned into a dragon. He's banished to an island, and it's going to take an encounter with Aslan the lion to undragon him. But again, it's another level, a depth of level in Eustace of preoccupation with self, a selfish person, how that's manifest. And we see how it affects all of his relationships. Pride may be the next level down. Selfishness made into a virtue. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we see that Lucy becomes a victim of pride, which is interesting because Lucy is the great character. I mean, Lucy in the Chronicles of Narnia, she is the character. It's so well written and it's marvelous. If you've seen the first movie, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, how many of you have seen that, the Hollywood version? The character who plays Lucy is just spot on. I think she's a young woman, and boy, it's just fantastic. We love the character of Lucy. My niece is named Lucy after Lucy in these books, and Lucy was the goddaughter for Lewis from Owen Barfield, and so this was the great character that he wanted to write. And in the first couple books, she can do no wrong. I mean, she is the one that gets Aslan first. She understands. But by the time we get to the third book, Lewis does an interesting thing, and he allows us to see a little bit of Lucy's flaws. We get to see her pride. She is still, in many ways, the sympathetic main character. We see this kind of through her closeness to Aslan. However, she still accepts a request of the Duffers to explore the magician's house, to find a spell, she's told. She's Queen Lucy now, but she is told that she could get a spell that could make her as beautiful as her older sister. That's a real temptation, right? She reads the magic book. We discover her temptations. We discover her secret desires. She's jealous of Susan's beauty, tempted because she wanted to make herself beautiful beyond the lot of mortals. But what happens when Aslan sees what's going on, the lion? Does anybody know what Aslan does? He gives a low growl of disapproval, and she's warned. She's given this low growl. Don't give in to this, Lucy. Don't let your pride do this to you. But then there's another opportunity she has, and she does give in, and it ruins a friendship that she has. But Aslan tried to warn her through his low growl as a result. So pride would be the next level down. And then we keep getting worse. Betrayal. This is maybe where we plot with our anger. It's evil institutionalized. We see this in Edmund, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It creates a kind of decay and chaos that can only be resolved with the cure of Aslan. Edmund, because he wants some of that Turkish delight that the witch would give to him. It tastes so good, and he wants more, and he wants more. And he's promised, if you come and if you follow me, I'll give you more Turkish delight. And he ends up turning on his brothers and sisters. It's a complete betrayal. I mean, it's hard to read. It's hard to understand how anyone would turn on the people closest to them. But sin has that power. Evil has the power to turn people because my desires and my wants, it can even lead to a point of betrayal. So what we're seeing here is the levels of sin, and we started with Mr. Tumnus, who was just weak. But then it brings us all the way down, and we see all these different levels portrayed beautifully in Lewis. And I think all good stories do this. All good stories take evil, darkness, sin, they take it seriously, but they show us in a very complex way. Not all bad people are all bad. See, that's not a very good story. We've probably seen movies like that where the evil ones are just too evil. It doesn't make sense. But evil is complex. Sometimes it manifests itself in ways that it's hard for us to see. We don't realize we're doing bad. Sometimes our attempts to do good can actually be turned into a complex form of selfishness and even betrayal. Lewis would understand, and Lewis would write and know that we can never be too confident when we talk about evil and how it's manifest. Like Reinhold Niebuhr, it's everywhere. It infiltrates everything. Even our best attempts and thoughts sometimes can be marred by really some bad motives that we may not even be aware of. Lewis gets this, and this is why his stories are so good. Because when we read them, we resonate. We say, yes, that's the world I live in. I understand that. Sometimes in the superhero villainous movies that we see now or books, you have all the dark evil and then the good on this side. That's not the way it actually is. It's far more complex. And Lewis understood that. And then finally, we would get to the bottom and what we might call spiritual sin, when we discover the power that can be found in evil, where we trust the power of evil. This is where there's a great battle for the soul. And when Lewis wrote Jadis, the witch, in the Chronicles of Narnia, we see this. This is someone who embodies pure evil in every way. So this is a little bit of Lewis's understanding, and we see this played out in the Chronicles of Narnia. We'll certainly see it as we talk about the Screwtape letters. But all good stories know this, I think. How many of you, I'm assuming most of us, you've seen the original Star Wars? Remember the original Star Wars? Do you know that George Lucas was a big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings? Tolkien understood this well too, right? When you read the Lord of the Rings, you have some evil characters, but you also have some weak hobbits sometimes. You have different characters. Tolkien and Lewis were brilliant at this. And George Lucas loved Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. He admitted this before he wrote Star Wars. He was influenced greatly by it. So I'm going to get real nerdy here for a second. So can I do that? I'll show you how this plays out in the Star Wars movies. We're introduced to these characters right at the beginning. Remember his aunt and uncle? They are just weak. What do they say to him? Don't get involved. Stay out of it. It's none of your business. So they're wrong. They're not evil, as we would call it, but they're really missing the mark. Just stay out of it. Don't have anything to do with it. That's just kind of the word that they give to Luke. So we're introduced to these characters right at the beginning. And then there's these people that are selfish, right? The sand people. And they are just selfish people. They're out for their own, greedy, and they're another level, what we might call evil. Not the worst in the movies, not the most awful, but they're just kind of scavengers and out for their own self-preservation. And then pride, right? We're introduced to this character who's really prideful, who's into his own wants, and he's all driven by his desires. Han Solo, right? And then we have institutional chaos. Remember that scene in the cantina, and there's all these people, and it's just evil kind of is institutionalized. It's everywhere. And then, right, we have another level of bad. You know where this is going, right? But these aren't the worst, right? There's a whole nother level, right? Who's the worst? Darth Vader, right? He's the witch. Do you see some analogies here to the queen, the white witch, Jada? And George Lucas was certainly influenced by their thinking. And that's why it's what makes really good stories, because it takes evil and the catastrophic, complex nature of evil very seriously. All right. Let's talk just briefly about human freedom, which is a really important theme in Lewis. In The Great Divorce, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, Lewis said this: there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." All who are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. To those who knock, it is opened. This is a common theme through Lewis. He talks a lot about human freedom. You and I, our ability to choose. Even in the final analysis, he says. Lewis says in another place that the doors of hell are locked on the inside. They're locked in the inside. That they choose it. You and I have the ability to choose. Now, we're in a Presbyterian church. We come from a tradition that talks a lot about God's sovereignty and God's working in and through us. We've been a part of the wing of the Christian church that wants to be really shy about human freedom and downplay it, because we want to uplift and say, God is moving and working in more ways than we can imagine. Evil is complex and catastrophic in more ways than we give it credit, but God is more pervasive and persuasive than we ever give him credit. We are sometimes very shy about this. Lewis is not shy at all. He loves to talk about the opportunity we have. Choose good and evil. It's our choice. Now, the doctrine of sovereignty and predestination, we might call it, is in many ways beyond our ability to even comprehend it and to grasp it. And at the end of the day, we still have to make decisions and choices, do we not? I like the simplistic way somebody put it is that everyone ought to start their life as a Southern Baptist. Can I get an amen? Everyone ought to start their life as a Southern Baptist. Why? Choice. You have to make a decision. When you're of age and you need to stand up, come down the sawdust trail, and you need to stand up for Jesus, you need to make that public statement. That's how we ought to start life. And then we ought to, in our middle life, ought to become Methodist, because Methodists are really into service, helping others, serving others. But if you follow the thinking, all of us ought to end our life as a Presbyterian, because we can look back on our life and say, God was directing and doing everything to bring me to this place. That's silly, but it's also, there is something that God's working ways we don't fully understand. But Lewis is really good at saying, okay, and we can see this in his autobiography. So Lewis is now talking about how he was converted, and I think these words are amazing. He said, in a sense, I was not moved by anything. I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. I say I chose, yet it did not really seem possible to do the opposite. On the other hand, I was aware of no motives. You could argue that I was not a free agent, but I am more inclined to think that this came nearer to being a perfectly free act than most that I have ever done. Necessity may not be the opposite of freedom, and perhaps a man is most free when, instead of producing motives, he could only say, I am what I do. In this one little paragraph, Lewis is arguing with himself. I made a decision. I loosed the reins. But on the other hand, I don't really know how this happened. I mean, I think it's a pretty good description of God was moving, God was involved, but maybe he pushed me to make a decision. Maybe he allowed it to happen. That's what Presbyterians would say. It's kind of what we hold. We hold this tension together. And I think Lewis does a pretty good job with that. He may err a little bit on the side of human freedom and our capacity to choose, but I like the way he puts it in a lot of his works, which brings us now to then what do we do with the opportunities in front of us in terms of evil. This is where he wrote one of his most famous books, the Screwtape Letters. The Screwtape Letters was written in 1942. So think about this. This was right in the middle. He's writing in London. This is right in the middle of World War II, at the height of World War II. He's writing. He said that he got the idea to write this one day when he was sitting in church through a long sermon. He had the idea of a senior devil writing to a junior devil. I often wonder about the preacher that day, how difficult that must be to realize that a book on evil came out of his sermon that day. But Lewis was daydreaming during the sermon. No one ever does that at Mountain View, but he was daydreaming and thinking about it. And he had this idea. He told his brother, what if we had a senior devil writing to a junior devil and they had a patient? How would the devil tempt the patient to move them away from the enemy? Now, this is important. When you read Screwtape, or when I talk about it tonight, the enemy is who? God. So everything's reversed. And Screwtape can't stand the enemy. And Wormwood, the junior devil who's tempting the patient, they can't stand. And the goal is to get them away from the enemy. Don't let them anywhere near God. And so they tempt, and they move. This book really put Lewis on the map. And it started actually as magazine entries. It was a monthly entry into a magazine called The Guardian. And so these came out once a month, and when they were all finished, they were compiled into a book. But it made him very famous. He was put on the cover of Time magazine because of the popularity of this book. It was interesting. I was just looking today at some things, and the books had a lot of impact. Some of you might know the name of David Foster Wallace. He was a really important writer for a lot of younger folks, millennials. He passed away a few years ago young, but he claimed that this was one of his top 10 favorite books, and he was not a Christian. He was not a believer, but he claimed this is one of his top books. There is a video by the rock band U2, and in that music video, the lead singer Bono is walking down the street, and if you look close, he's holding a copy of the Screwtape Letters in his hand. Ronald Reagan quoted from the Screwtape Letters in his famous 1983 speech to the National Association of Evangelicals. And Anton Scalia, the former justice on the Supreme Court, claimed that he said the Screwtape Letters is a great book. It really is, just as a study of human nature. And that's true. Take away the evil and the demonic part of this. Lewis had a keen insight into how our minds work. It's absolutely masterful how he did this. He does claim that this was a very difficult book to write. He had to get into the mind of the devil. That's hard. It was very difficult for him to write. When you sit down with a pen and I've got to start thinking about the devil's thoughts, That's hard. It's really dark. And he says it was not the easiest thing for him to do. But what we learn from this book is our tendencies, our human nature. Great insight into who we are because of this book. Lewis begins the Screwtape letters by saying this: there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors. That's how he starts this book, and I think he's absolutely right on that. Years ago, when I was in college, there was a series of fictional books written by a man named Frank Peretti called This Present Darkness. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was about spiritual warfare. And I remember I was at summer camp with a lot of college students, and we were volunteering, and a lot of people were reading this book, and it just scared the daylights out of everyone. And a couple people in that camp got so consumed with this, convinced that the devil was everywhere. Anytime something dropped, anytime something broke, anytime something happened, it was, oh my gosh, we're under attack, it's spiritual warfare, and they became consumed by it. I've seen this in times. The parking space didn't open up, someone got before me, it must have been the devil who took that away. I mean, we can become, if we want to, everything can be seen and blamed on the satanic and the devil, and it can leave us fearful. I've been around this at times, and it's just not healthy. And I love that Lewis warns us and says, no, that's not the way. On the other hand, to deny that there is such a thing, and I've been in those communities too. I've been in some Christian circles where people have openly asked, well, you don't believe in anything like the devil, do you? I mean, that's all fable and nonsense. See, I think both are grave errors, and Lewis says this. Martin Luther said the one thing that the devil can't stand. Anybody know what this is? There's one thing the devil cannot stand. Those are good guesses. He said the devil can't stand to be laughed at, to be mocked and laughed. Sometimes in his study late at night, Luther would be studying and he would just get worked up and he'd see the devil, and this was his tactic. He would just start laughing at him. You can't do anything to me. You're nothing. I've already won the victory. So Luther was well acquainted with that. I think Lewis certainly agreed with that. And so there is some humor in this, but also Lewis, I think, takes this very, very seriously. Okay, so what would Lewis say that the devil would say about these topics? What would the devil want to say to his patient about the church? If you got into the mind of the devil, now this is Screwtape writing letters to Wormwood. Wormwood is tempting the patient, and Screwtape is saying, here's advice, here's what you need to know. Get into church, but not too involved. The church is full of a lot of hypocrites and self-righteous people. Yeah. I think those are probably true. This is what Screwtape says to Wormwood. My dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your better moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. One of our great allies at present is the church. The church itself. Now, do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her spread out through all time and space, rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. But fortunately, it is quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer with a rather oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. You know, Lewis, one thing I do disagree with Lewis on, he did not like church music at all. He didn't like hymns in church. He never came to Mountain View, so never heard our choir. When he gets to his pew and looks around him, he sees that selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ to the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people that the next pew contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior in the enemy's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool, provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or old clothes. The patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind, which he supposes to be spiritual, but which, in fact, is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs, and the mere fact that other people in church wear modern clothes at all is a real, although unconscious difficulty to him. Keep everything hazy in his mind for now. So do you see what's happening? And I think this is really keen insight. Use the church, he says, to your advantage. Have him look down the row and go, I know that person. They're not living the way, the ideal, John said, that I expect. Everything is new for me and fresh, but once you get into his mind the disappointment of how the church really is, then we will win him back. I hear this. Do you hear this? There's people that say, well, I don't go to church anymore. You know how disappointing those people were? Yeah, I do. I'm one of them. That's the church. Raise his expectation, the patient, and then hit him with reality of what really is. All right, that's use the church to advantage. How about what would you think Screwtape would say? What do you think Screwtape would say about war? Is that something the devil would want? Yes. Idealize war. Yeah. This is a really fascinating chapter. And it's written during the war. Remember, this is 1942. So Wormwood says to Screwtape, hey, a war is starting. This is really good. We're going to win everybody over. Screwtape says, not so fast. It's really interesting. He says, of course, a war is entertaining. The immediate fear of suffering of the humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toiling workers. But what permanent good does it do to us unless we make use of it for bringing souls to our Father below? When I see the temporal suffering of humans who finally escape us, I feel as if I had been allowed to taste the first course of a rich banquet and then denied the rest. It is worse than to not have tasted it at all. The enemy, God, true to his barbarous methods of warfare, allows us to see the short misery of his favorites only to tantalize and torment us, to mock the incessant hunger which during this present phase of the great conflict, his blockade is admittedly imposing. He often makes prizes of humans who have given their lives for causes he thinks bad on the the monstrous ground that the humans thought them good and were following the best they knew. What he's arguing is he's saying that even for a wrong cause, fighting for a wrong cause and doing difficult things can bring out some pretty incredible things. Courage, valor, sacrifice for someone else. And what happens when you're in great fear and danger all the time? What might you be tempted to do? Pray, right? What do they say about conversions in foxholes? So the devil writes, wait a minute, don't get so preoccupied and excited about war. Some really, from his perspective, bad things can come out of a war. Valor, courage, self-sacrifice, prayer. We got to be really, really careful with that. Isn't that an interesting argument? To see it from kind of the eternal perspective. We don't think of it that way. But Lewis looked at it from an entirely different kind of perspective. All right, let me move to human freedom. This is from chapter 8. This is one of the best known passages in this book. Screwtape says, to us, a human is primarily food. The devil says, to us, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. But the obedience which the enemy demands of men is quite a different thing. One must face the fact that all that talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself. Creatures whose life on its miniature scale will be quantitatively like his own, not because he has absorbed them, but because their wills freely conform to his. And the devil says this, we want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in, he wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. I think this is one of the best passages in this book, talking about the differences. God is full. He's self-giving, sacrificial. He wants us to choose to be with him because of his great love. The devil wants to coerce. The devil wants to control. The devil wants to take. God wants to give. The differences are just mind-boggling. In chapter 9, he talks about pleasure. What do you think the devil would say about pleasure? Good, bad? Steve said a preoccupation with it. Kind of pleasure can go both ways. It's really interesting. I think Lewis has some really good insight here. Lewis was not an ascetic in any ways. He felt and argued that pleasure is something that God has created. In fact, this is what he says. Never forget that, the Screwtape says, never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal, satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, less the redolent of its maker and least pleasurable, an ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. So what the devil is saying is, let them have pleasure. We're going to have to let that ground go. We're going to have to concede that we're on enemy territory. Whenever human beings have good pleasures, what we're going to have to do is corrupt them, the devil says. I've mentioned this before, but you know the Greek word for, there's a Greek word in porneo. The Greek word porneo means to twist. So the word pornography is based on a twisting of a good pleasure. So God's good gift of sexuality, if it's twisted, it can become corrupt. And we see that. We know that very easily. We know how the pleasures, through overuse, through a desire for more and more and more and more and more, can become corruptive and deadening. That's what the devil says. We're just going to have to corrupt them. We're going to have to make their desire so great that they will never be satisfied. And that's what we call addiction. I got to have, and then that very thing that started out as a pleasure can be twisted and corrupted to be something so horrific and awful. It can become a great burden. And that's what the devil does. But notice, it's not a denial of pleasure. Lewis never says we need to avoid pleasure. No, all of the pleasures are God-given, used as they were intended. But all of them can be easily corrupted by the devil. Okay, what would the devil say about humor? I'm not going to be able to do all these probably, but what do you think? Would the devil like humor or not? Does the devil want us to use humor? This is a tricky one. Done.
As a Christian, we believe in building up. I think that the devil would want you to find humor in people's mistakes.
The devil would want us to find humor in people's mistakes. Yeah. I would think. I think laughter is one of the pleasures. It's one of the great joys, right? And I think humor is really important. This one is a really unique argument that Lewis makes. What he says is there's great danger in humor. Sarcasm is a form of humor. But what Lewis says the worst form of humor that the devil loves is what Lewis calls flippancy. But flippancy is the best of all. In the first place, it is very economical. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue, or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it, but every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they have already found a ridiculous side to it. If prolonged, flippancy builds up around a man the finest armor against the enemy that I know. You know, it's possible to go through life and talk about politics and just be flippant about all of it. Side comments, and you never deal with anything important. And Lewis saw that as the devil's work. And that we ought to be really careful with our humor. I think, Donna, you make a good point. I don't think Lewis would argue that humor, joking, laughing at ourselves, laughing at each other. But there is a dark side to humor that can be really destructive to a society and to our own souls. Just quickly, I'm going to go through a couple more of these. Sin, I want to read you just a really important passage in chapter 12. Wormwood says that, you know, I need to get my patient to start committing some really bad, awful sins. Right? I mean, what are the big, bad, awful sins? Murder, adultery. I mean, you know what I really need is to get my patient to do one of these really, really bad things. Screwtape writes and says, wait a minute, hold on. That may not be the best strategy. Isn't this interesting? The only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, the soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. This is terrifying. What happens to someone who's convicted of murder? At some level, not all, but they might know that they're guilty, and what might they do? They might repent and say, I'm sorry. The devil would rather have us slowly, gradually drift away, and so that we never know that it's happening. You see the complex, insidious nature of evil. Lastly, in chapter 15, he talks about time, and I'll just briefly mention, because I think it's a really important one. Lewis talks about how there are 4 time periods. There's the past, there's the present, there's the future, and there's the eternal. He says, I want your patient to live in 2 of those. It's really good if your patient lives in the past. What's in the past? Regrets. The good old days. Boy, I wish I could go back there. I don't like now. It was so good back then, or it was so awful and I live with pains. Get your patient to live in the past. Or have them live in the future. I wish my life was better. I can't wait until this is over. I just want to get to that place. It's going to be better then. The devil wants us to live in those 2 places, times. He says, don't let your patient live in the present. What's in the present? What do we receive in the present? We receive manna. We receive what God provides for this day, and I can be thankful, and I can live with him, not living in these. The present, he says, is the worst. Don't have them live this day as a gift from God. The other alternative is it's okay to live in the eternal. There's seasons and times of life where I can't wait to get there. I can't wait for what happens. But isn't that interesting? There's 2 tenses we can live in, that should live in, and 2 that we should not. Okay, so that's Screwtape. It's not an easy book to read. It's a brilliant book. You have to kind of read it once, read it slower, read it again, but I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book. This may be the most famous passage in this book. He says, do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our Father's will, looks around upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys. Now, finally, I've got just a couple minutes left. The definition of the good. What did J.R.R. Tolkien? You can't just talk about evil in your stories. You can't just talk about it. That's not a good story. You have to have some example of good. And J.R.R. Tolkien had Gandalf as the wonderful good in his stories. Gandalf, the wonderful, wise, great character. George Lucas, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's right. Obi-Wan Kenobi. They are the personification. You can see where Lucas was influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien. These are such great characters. Lewis dared to take it a step further. In some ways, it's much easier to talk about the wrong and evil than it is to define the good. But I think, I'm biased, I think nobody did it better than Lewis. I think in his Chronicles of Narnia, he was able to give us a picture of the good better than anyone else when he brought forth Aslan the lion. Into the midst of the chaos of evil, we are seeing the good, and I think Aslan. And it's a very delicate thing to write this, and I think Lewis did it absolutely brilliantly. Okay, I've got a couple minutes for any questions. Yes, Judy.
Are you saying, or is Lewis saying that all sin is evil?
Is Lewis saying that all sin is evil? I would think so, yeah. Yeah. Sin is to miss the mark. It is a move away from God. Yeah. And I think Lewis and Niebuhr and others, I think some of the best theologians, thinkers would say, and it's so much more pervasive than we ever could admit. And the worst place in life we could be is to stand up and say, well, I don't have any of that in me. A much better place would be, oh, it's just in and through me. It's everywhere. All my motives. I can't believe what I thought and what I said, because then you're ready to meet the good. So, yeah. Yes, Steve? The question is, what's the timing of Lewis's conversion in the Screwtape letters? He was converted about 1927. This was written in 1942. So he's already written some Christian books up to this point. This was the one, though, Screwtape letters, that put him on the map. This is the one that he really became famous for. The others were, he wrote a book called Miracles, and I talked a little bit about Problem of Pain. They had some good marks. Miracles actually got some bad reviews. He got stung a little bit because some people in the church said, what are you doing? You're a lay person. Why would you write? You're getting into areas that you shouldn't have anything to do with. That stung him a bit. But Screwtape was the one that I think, and it might have been difficult for Lewis because his popularity probably didn't go over too well at Oxford, that Oxford Dons did not write books like that for the masses. But I'm really grateful that Lewis did. So, one more. We have another question. Yeah.
Not a question, but we caught Screwtape in the theater.
Yes.
And it was wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Max McLean has done a theatrical performance of Screwtape. Max McLean is a good Presbyterian, by the way, and he's a great actor, and I've had the privilege of getting to meet him and briefly, and he's a really neat man, and he's come through town. I saw him on Broadway, and we took a group from our church he's come through more recently, but we took a group about 7 years ago. And it was absolutely wonderful, the show he put on. And I think you might be able to see, there might be online, captured on video. But okay, I promise each week I'm going to close with a story. So sit back, close your eyes if you want to. I'm just going to read. This is from the end of the last book of the Chronicles of Narnia, from the last battle. At the very end of the last battle, Narnia has been transformed. Aslan has come back, and it's Lewis's account of the second coming. And so Aslan has made everything right. And everything is new, and there's much rejoicing. But there is this stable, and inside this stable, there's a group of dwarves. And these dwarves are eating and drinking and gobbling everything down, and they are refusing to come out. Everything was dark and barren, but now everything's become green, and Aslan has made everything right. But these dwarfs will not see it. And Lucy is very upset by this. "Oh dear," said Lucy, "what are we to do for them?" "Let them alone," said Eustace, but as he spoke, the earth trembled. The sweet air grew suddenly sweeter. A brightness flashed behind them. All turned. Tyrion turned last because he was afraid. There stood his heart's desire, huge and real, the golden lion, Aslan himself. And already the others were kneeling in a circle around his forepaws and burying their hands and faces in his mane as he stooped his great head to touch them with his tongue. And then he fixed his eyes upon Tyrion, and Tyrion came near, trembling, and flung himself at the lion's feet. And the lion kissed him and said, "Well done, last of the kings of Narnia, who stood firm at the darkest hour." "Aslan," Lucy said through her tears, could you do something for these poor dwarfs?" "Dearest," said Aslan, "I will show you both what I can and what I cannot do." He came close to the dwarfs and gave a low growl. Low, but it set the air shaking. But the dwarfs said to one another, "Hear that? That's the gang at the other end of the stable trying to frighten us. They do it with a machine of some kind. Don't take any notice. They won't take us in again." Aslan raised his head and shook his mane. Instantly, a glorious feast appeared on the dwarf's knees, pies and tongues and pigeons and trifles and ices and each dwarf had a goblet of good wine in his right hand, but it wasn't much use. They began eating and drinking greedily enough, but it was clear that they couldn't taste it properly. They thought they were eating and drinking only the sort of things you might find in a stable. One said he was trying to eat hay, and another said he had got a bit of an old turnip, and a third said he had found a raw cabbage leaf. And they raised golden goblets of rich red wine to their lips and said, "Ugh, fancy drinking dirty water out of a trough that a donkey's been at. Never thought we'd come to this." But very soon, every dwarf began suspecting that every other dwarf had found something nicer than he had. And they started grabbing and snatching and went on to quarreling, till in a few minutes there was a free fight, and all the good food was smeared on their faces and clothes and trodden underfoot. But when at last they sat down to nurse their black eyes and their bleeding noses, they all said, "Well, at any rate, there's no humbug here. We haven't let anyone take us in. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs." "You see," said Aslan, "they will not let us help them. They have chosen cunning instead of belief. Their prison is only in their own minds, and yet they are in that prison, and so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out. But come, children, I have other work to do." Do you hear the doctrine of human freedom in there? Do you hear pleasures being twisted? And those that are unable to enjoy the pleasure that Aslan's provided because it's been corrupted in their minds. I just think it's a vivid, vivid description that Lewis gives of the opportunity we have to taste and see, as the psalmist says, that the Lord is good. Let us pray. Lord, thank you for this good reminder tonight that Lewis gives. It is tempting to be so captivated by evil and the demonic, but we won't do that. We'll be wise as serpents and guarded, but we also know that you have made all things new, and that we do not need to live in fear. That the good has been defined and presented and given to us. And we see it so clearly in Jesus when you came and lived among us. And all things have been made new. Help us to know that and to live that as we go from this place. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.